If the Marlowe, Shakespeare authorship theory, is supposed to make any sense at all, surviving, concealed, Marlowe, as the true Shakespeare with his outrageous abilities of a universal genius, must have lived under changing incognito names and written under changing pseudonyms, often of existing or invented names, such as Shakespeare or, in this video, Shelton. Thomas Shelton, whose translation of Don Quixote, Part 1, was printed in 1612, the second part in 1620 is a literally totally unknown person of English literature, shrouded in mystery, who, conspicuously, cannot be precisely localized in terms of time and place. Be aware, very little is known about Thomas Shelton himself. There are no substantial records of his life, which is rather unusual for someone who accomplished such a significant literary task between 1606 and 1612. It inevitably led most scholars to speculate that Thomas Shelton could not possibly have been a real person, but rather a pseudonym for a more well-known writer or translator of the time who wished to remain anonymous for significant reasons. In his dedication of the history of the witty knight-errant Don Quixote in 1612, Thomas Shelton explains to his patron Baron Walden that 6 years earlier he had translated the history of Don Quixote within 40 days out of the Spanish tongue into the English. As late as in the 1870s, 80s, literary experts, for the first time, began to address the question, who this very first English translator of Don Quixote, Thomas Shelton, in 1612, in fact was. The thesis and arguments of this video: sometimes during his long absence, banishment and exile from England between 1597 and 1616, with stays in France, Italy, Spain, Ireland, Scotland, Denmark, Holland and others, and multiple returns home, the true Shakespeare must have lived, incognito with selected names as Thomas Shelton, Jacques Ledoux, Tobias Matthew. The longer one deals with the literary contributions of Thomas Shelton, such as translations, poems, letters, prose texts, etc., one gets the impression that Shelton never existed as a real person, but only as a masking pseudonym. A list of verifiable connections in England shows that Thomas Shelton from 1609 to 1611 was regularly honoured on diplomatic missions for his work as a bearer of letters and embassies to the Netherlands, and was in contact with the ambassador of the United Netherlands, Sir Ralph Winwood, in The Hague. By Shelton's absence, banishment, exile from England between 1597 and questionable 1618, some contexts, 1613, 1614, can be clarified from an exchange of letters between Thomas Shelton and the English ambassador in Brussels, William Trumbull. Shelton must have been in Holland and Belgium between 1612 and 1614. In 1613 he left Brussels for Paris. He persuaded Trumbull to write for him a letter of introduction to Sir Thomas Edmondes, the English ambassador in Paris. This telling us a lot about Thomas Shelton. Trumbull wrote, "The gentleman, one Thomas Shelton, the part wherewith he condemned, is learning the Spanish tongue, wherein he excelleth. The French and his experience in the world, the affairs of Ireland, do make him recommendable in all places among men of the best quality." Shelton's letter, October 23rd, 1613, admitting, "Whilst I do expect a better fortune," reveals a personality of the stature of the true Shakespeare, as one would imagine, with his obligations and diplomatic duties, as a messenger of embassies between England and European royalties who spoke many languages. Shelton's letter, March 6, 1613, favours him as the translator of Don Quixote because he hopes for promises from Lord Walden, to whom he dedicated the translation of Don Quixote in 1612. In Shelton's letter, you may anticipate his appalling abyss. He knows no means how to return to England, how he may go home safely and soon. If Shelton is only handed down to this day as the unknown translator of Cervantes' Don Quixote, the letters and context presented so far disclose an unexplored problem of a highly educated English personality in exile, with unknown references to the true Shakespeare. It is of immeasurable importance. The registration of the English Don Quixote in the Printer's Register was by Edward Blount, who also printed Marlowe's Hero and Leander and Shakespeare's First Folio. Don Quixote, Part 1, was published in 1612 as quarto, Part 2 in 1620, also by Edward Blount with a revision of Part 1, but astonishingly, without naming Thomas Shelton again. Thomas Shelton dedicated a 28-verse sonnet to the author of the book entitled A Restitution of Decayed Intelligence in Antiquities, Richard Rowland Verstagen, the sonnet entitled To His Dear Friend. Who was this Verstagen? By reflecting Thomas Shelton's 28-line, 4-stanza poem to Versteegen, line by line, striking textual and contextual similarities and parallels become evident. This comparison lends strong support to the thesis that Shelton and Marlowe were the same individual, with Shelton being one of the pseudonyms used by the true Shakespeare, who was in fact Marlowe. Given today's scientific standards for probabilistic analysis, it is untenable to consider the contextual parallels found in all 28 lines as merely coincidental. Richard Rowland Versteegen had to leave England, analogous to Marlowe, after he had printed a banned book about the death of the executed martyr Edmund Campion. Short-term arrests in Paris and stays in Italy are documented. He is said to have lived in Antwerp for the longest time as a poet, writer, publisher, printer, agent, and smuggler of books and people. This and much more suggests close, unexplained, references to the True Shakespeare. Just read, compare and reflect hereafter in Shelton's consecutive 28 poem lines dedicated to Verstegen, his astonishing textual affinity to lines in Shakespeare's work. Ask yourself, is it tenable to regard the demonstrated contextually related parallelism and affinities between Shelton and Shakespeare of full 28 consecutive lines as purely accidental? The same is true for Shelton's poetic answer, 11 lines, in Richard Nugent's Cynthia, 1604. See next. Even more enigmatic and troubling is Shelton's translation of Don Quixote, full of pitiful utterances and exclamations, of epigrams and derisive proverbs, such as are found in a strikingly similar and by no means purely accidental form in Shakespeare's plays See and Read Next. Thomas Shelton, who remained invisible and was never identified, had ingenious traits. Nobody knows what he did before and after the translation of the two parts of Don Quixote, and whether he only existed as a name on paper. His, Shelton's, full letter in 1612 to Robert Cecil, phrases marked with 25 numbers, can be recognized as the utterance of a man of high moral principles. He lets the powerful Robert Cecil know that he is not ready to take the position of a subordinate. It is again not tenable to regard these contextually related lines between Shelton and Shakespeare as purely accidental and thus a non-ignorable indicator that Shelton and Marlowe, the true Shakespeare, were one and the same person. Those who have not yet been able to accept that behind Shelton the true Shakespeare Marlowe hides may read his largely unknown book, A Century of Similes, 1640, in which he poetically develops 100 similes with the surprising title line, "I will open my mouth in a parable." This reminds one to Launce's exclamation in Shakespeare's play, Two Gentlemen of Verona, "Thou shalt never get such a secret from me, but by a parable." Let's contemplate exemplarily three selected similes, 3, 15, and 35, of Shelton dealing with his, the author's, death. Simile 3, death of wicked men, as a madman after sleep is more outrageous when the malignant humour is concocted, so after death wicked man awakes with eternal horror. The parable, Simile 3, deals with the unveiling of the author's awakening after sleep and after death. What a fantastic revelation! The metaphorical phrase Shelton is pointing to relates to himself, a deceased man who nevertheless awaked after death and lived on, but with never-ending, eternal horror. Simile 15, death of wicked men, untimely, an apple, though it hang long on the tree, yet if it be gathered before it be ripe, it is plucked untimely. So a wicked man, though he live a long time, yet his death is untimely, because he is taken away before he is fitted for death. The author's death occurred when he was plucked like an apple, untimely, before ripened. He was taken away before he was fitted for death, though he lived a long time. What an amazing absolute blueprint of Marlowe's life paradox. He lived a long time with an untimely death. He was taken away before he was fitted for death. Simile 35, difference of men after death. The hawk flies high and is much made of being alive, but being dead is good for nothing but the dunghill. The hen scrapes in the dust when she is alive, but being dead is brought as a choice dish to her master's table. So wicked men prosper, and good men are abased in this life. But being dead, the one is cast into the dungeon, the other advanced to the palace. The allegory of Simile 35 revolves around the contradictions between genius and mediocrity, the hawk versus the hen, and between their worth in life and death. Note, in many Shakespeare plays, its real or true author, Marlowe, uses the metaphor of the dunghill. Do you see it as a coincidence that Shelton uses the metaphor of a dunghill, when knowing that true Shakespeare used the term of a dunghill quite often in his plays? Interrupt and read examples. Can it also really be coincidence that the author's name Thomas Shelton bore the first and last name of Marlowe's most important patron, Thomas Walsingham, whose wife was Lady Shelton? Unequivocal contextual arguments definitely support the Marlowe Shakespeare authorship thesis, asserting that Thomas Shelton belongs to the multitude of pseudonyms employed by the real Shakespeare, alias Marlowe. Thomas Shelton can be regarded as one of the perfect candidate for the Marlowe Shakespeare authorship thesis. Marlowe, the true Shakespeare alive, incognito, in exile, banished, highly educated, and Shelton, one of his multiple pen names.